materials in the weapons. They agreed to reprocess the nuclear warheads into lower enriched uranium for use in Ukraine's nuclear power plants for the next 10 years. Third, Russia would forgive $2.5 billion worth of Russian oil and gas debts to Ukraine. Finally, the United States would agree to provide all the financial and technical assistance to eliminate the entire rocket army and the strategic bomber force. These three parts are recognized by Kiev, Kiev negotiators in Moscow, Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry and Foreign Defense Ministry, and the United States by the DoD, Department of Defense, as well as the State Department and the national security experts. In mid-January 1944, in Moscow, President Yeltsin, Kuchma, and Clinton signed the Trilateral Agreement in January of 1994. This agreement set forth a series of actions in Ukraine. The Ukraine Minister of Defense called the commander of the 43rd Rocket Army, General Machuk, into his office in Kiev. He demanded he take an oath of loyalty either to Russia or to Ukraine. He gave him 30 minutes to decide. After the general agreed, he was ordered to return to his army headquarters. He convened all the officers in the missile divisions and explained to them what the situation was with the Trilateral Agreement, and then they asked that they sign a loyalty oath or the return to the rocket forces. During the next week, General Machuk, who I interviewed in Ukraine, General Machuk met with the officers and men of his rocket army, explained the situation, and asked for their decision. He said approximately 900 officers decided to go back to Russia, and the remainder, a couple hundred, stayed with the army. A week later, the first Russian military train arrived at the army depot to pick up the nuclear warheads in the storage depot, the nuclear storage depot. They were led by General Yevgeny Maslin, who I interviewed as well. Russia began to transport nuclear materials, nuclear weapons from the 43rd Rocket Army in Ukraine's storage depot to reprocessing plants in Russia. According to agreements from Russian and Ukrainian experts, one Ukrainian officer would be on the train and would accompany the weapons to the reprocessing plant to account for everything. During the transfer, a Ukrainian military officer would be present at the nuclear storage site. He would conduct an inventory, and then he would accompany the shipment to the Russian plant. Shortly after the transfer began, William Perry, Secretary of the United States Defense Department, arrived in Ukraine to witness the first Rocket Army missile dismantlement. Then began the Rocket Army's forces' long 7-year decommissioning, deactivation, dismantlement process. As these events unfolded, the President of Ukraine and his senior ministers went before the Ukrainian Parliament. They explained the new situation regarding the Trilateral Agreement, the Russian security agreements, the Russian compensation, and the promises of American cooperation. They had advocated the Parliament ratified the START Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Debate was vigorous, but the Parliament decided to ratify the START Treaty. On the second treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they did not ratify it. 8 months later, they took it up again and ratified this international treaty. When it was presented at the conference in Budapest, OSCE conference in Budapest, Hungary in December, Russia, United States, Great Britain gave Ukraine assurances of sovereignty and its secure borders. A few months later, China and France issued a similar statement, guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. At this point, all 5 nations of the United Nations Security Council had agreed to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. It didn't say they would come to their defense, but it said it would guarantee it in statements. As this complex military and diplomatic agreement worked out over the next decade, Ukraine turned to Russia, Europe, and the United States to develop its foreign relations. It established embassies and consulates in the United States and in every European nation. It signed and it participated in the 6 major arms control agreements of the 1990s, the START Treaty, the CFE Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. It decided to participate in NATO's Partnership for Peace program. The government began major programs to stabilize the currency and the economy. They worked with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to qualify international loans to help Ukraine's national bank stabilize the currency, stabilize the economy. During these events, the Ukrainian government suffered through endemic corruption through its ministers and parliamentarians. In 2000, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister recommended to the President of the government that he initiate Ukraine's entry into the European Union. President Kravchuk rejected this advice. He said he'd like to have a multi-vector foreign policy, one involving Russia, United States, and European nations. In 2004, Ukraine held its national presidential election. One candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was from Western Ukraine. Next. There's Yushchenko. He had been prime minister, he had been director of the National Bank. The other candidate was Viktor Yanukovych. He was an Eastern oligarch, a skilled politician, and currently prime minister. The election campaign was filled with massive voter fraud, massive irregularities, Russian influence, and voting corruption. When Yanukovych won, huge demonstration in Kiev led to the election commission and the National Supreme Court examining the vote and ordering a new election, which they did. In the next election, Yushchenko won, and he held the office, took the office of president. He supported Ukraine's entry into NATO, and he began the application for joining the European Union. Then in 2010, okay, next. Can you see that? Is that clear? No. All right. If you look to the left, excuse me. If you look to your right, or in this section over here, this is what Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine. They tend to be pro-national Ukraine, nationalistic. Over here, on your right side, is where Southern Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, excuse me, Southern Ukraine, Western Ukraine. They tend to be pro-Russian, these two areas. And the vote was very close in 2010. Policy changed. Viktor Yanukovych, he was elected the president in that year. With Putin's strong support, he stops Ukraine's application in the NATO alliance, and in 2014 he canceled the bid to be part of the European Union. As a result, riots and demonstrations broke out in Western Ukraine and in Central Ukraine, involving thousands of people. They all camped out around Kiev. There were huge demonstrations that lasted for months. It was not just about the election, it was about the direction of foreign policy in Ukraine. Many the president, Yanukovych, decided not to interfere with the demonstrations for a few weeks. And then after that, he decided to crack down hard. And when he cracked down hard, many demonstrators were killed. And the Ukrainian parliament met and examined the situation and decided to fire the president. So they fired the president. He left the city of Kiev. Demonstrators chased him out of the city of Kiev, actually. He fled into Russia. Less than 2 weeks later, Putin ordered Russian military troops to invade Ukraine. They were successful, and they decided to move into the area of Crimea. They seized the government of Crimea, and they decided to have a referendum, and they decided to leave Ukraine. A week later, the Congress, the Parliament in Russia decided to vote that they would accept Crimea into Russia. 2 weeks later, Russian military forces occupied eastern Ukraine, specifically the Donbass and Luhansk region. Ukraine had no national border defense. Its army was poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly led. The army did try to reoccupy these regions, but was unsuccessful. As a result, in the last 4 years, more than 10,000 people, 1.5 million people have been displaced. More than 10,000 people have died, and more than 1.5 million people in the eastern Ukraine have been displaced from their homes. Since then, all diplomatic attempts to oppose economic and political sanctions have been unsuccessful. Why did Putin move against Ukraine in 2014 so suddenly? One historian, Andrew Wilson, author of The Ukrainian Crisis, wrote that Putin's actions were a result of Russia's addiction to a dangerous myth. Specifically, Putin believed and asserted that the nations of the former Soviet Union were lost territories of Russia. One American scholar, John Mearsheimer, wrote in Foreign Affairs that great powers are always sensitive to potential threats from their loss of their home territory. What threats were there? I didn't see any myself. In addition, the possibility that Ukraine would join the European Union and NATO alliance was not a threat to Russia. In a different analysis, Andrew McCall and Catherine Stoner-Weiss stated in the Washington Quarterly that, quote, Putin's foreign policy changed responses to new political and economic changes in Russia in 2011, 2012. Putin needed to come to perpetual conflict with external enemies. One should always remember that the Soviet Union was an imperial state which had expanded its empire in World War II over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. It used its military forces, and once in power, it exerted control over its foreign affairs. Putin, a KGB officer during the Soviet Union, was shaped by this imperial state, and a Russian president, as a Russian president, he exerted power over Ukraine. In this conflict, Ukraine was a loser. Thank you very much.
From Eastern Europe, we move now back to the Western Balkans with Lieutenant Colonel Hans-Peter Krimen. He will be the next presenter. Is currently an officer in the German Armed Forces. Is a researcher at the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Science, Operation Survey and Support Division. Is a lecturer at the Potsdam University and Bundeswehr University in Munich. Is a lecturer at the Army Officers School in Dresden, and in his military career was many things: platoon commander, company commander, as many of his comrades in the NATO army served in Afghanistan, in ISAF, was chief military police in the PRT and Faizabad. His research is the newest Bundeswehr history since 1990, military history of German Democratic Republic, and operational history of 18th to 20th century. And this presentation will be NATO of use of force and the birth of Kosovo, 1999, a German perspective. It will be very interesting to see another part of the disgregation of Yugoslavia analysis. Thank you so much.
A warm hello to everybody today, and my sincere thanks to the Commission for accepting my paper and giving me the opportunity to present my findings here and today. And please make sure your cell phones are properly turned on so you don't miss any calls and messages. Okay, let me begin with an incident which is characteristic for the Kosovo conflict in the 1990s. That is the massacre of Račak. On January 10th, 1999, a Serbian police officer was killed near Racak in Kosovo. As a consequence, Serbian security forces cordoned off the village on January 15th, 1999. This was followed by fierce fighting and the arrest of several persons by Serbian security forces. When KVM, that is the OSCE Kosovo Verification Mission, observers visited the location in late afternoon, they found one dead and several injured persons, but they were told of other deaths and arrests. The following day, the OSCE members discovered 11 bodies in houses and 23 dead in a ditch above the village, some of whom had been mutilated. William Walker, the US diplomat and KVM leader, personally came to Racak, accompanied by journalists of the international press, and gave an emotional report of the events, which triggered a huge media response. The events, which Walker qualified as a massacre, became a political topic for debate with images of horribly mutilated people and had a polarizing effect on the public response and the political evaluation. At that time, it was not yet clear what had actually happened in Racak. Although there had been many severe incidents with more death in the preceding months of the Kosovo conflict, Racak was and continues to be a symbol of the guilt of the Serbian government for the crimes against humanity committed against the Kosovo Albanians. In fact, on the 16th of January 1999, the attempt to contain the Kosovo conflict with the help of KVM had failed, in a manner similar to the Dayton process. The negotiations at Rambouillet, which had begun in early February 1999, in response to the so-called Racak massacre, were to result in the signing of a peace agreement, and as with SFOR in Bosnia, 50,000 armed peacekeepers were to implement this agreement afterwards. The negotiation failed, however, and on March 24, 1999, the air war of NATO against the FRY, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, began. In the following minutes, I would like to present my recent findings, which have not been published yet, and I would like to have a look at how NATO became gradually involved in the Kosovo conflict, resulting in the first war in NATO's history, and how that led to the creation of a new European state. Only a few weeks after the escalation of the Kosovo conflict in late February, early March 1998, the intensity of the fights had increased considerably. Many Kosovo Albanians had been expelled from their hometowns and villages. The German federal government was afraid that Germany would be confronted with a similar influx of refugees like it had been at the beginning of the decade after the civil wars in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina had broken out. Therefore, Germany and France considered military options of deterrence in order to ensure regional stability on the Balkans. For reasons of domestic policy and legitimation, the US government could only envision US participation in military activities against the FRY in the multilateral context of NATO. The United States were not in a position to do anything in this respect in view of the domestic challenges caused by the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. Sandy Berger, the then security advisor of US President Bill Clinton, was not interested in exposing other areas of conflict. In view of the principle of consensus, which only allowed for joint action, he feared NATO would fail. This had to be avoided by any means. The Franco-German tandem, meanwhile, explored options of assigning the task to the Western European Union, the WEU. This soon failed, however, because the German federal government did not think it was in a position to make an appropriate military contribution. The talks centered on the surveillance of the Kosovo border with Albania. Based on the experiences in Bosnia, the Germans feared that an escalation of the situation could indeed necessitate the use of military coercive measures during such a mission. For domestic reasons, this was only an option if there was a mandate for the employment of armed forces as specified in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter as a matter of principle. On April 1, 1998, German Foreign Minister Klaus Kinke and German Minister of Defense Volker Rühe discussed possible military implications for the further conflict resolution process. 2 days later, after careful consideration, the German Federal Ministry of Defense rejected all proposals of the German Foreign Office, with the exception of a participation in a potential follow-up mission of the United Nations preventive deployment in Macedonia. As a result, the number of WEU police advisors in Albania was increased from 60 to 100 police officers, by the way, the only WEU participation in this conflict. After the hope for dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina did not come about within a week after the last meeting of the contact group of March 25, 1998, as the German federal government had intended, and the prospects for a diplomatic solution continued to fade, the German Foreign Office and the person of political director Wolfgang Ischinger approached the US administration in Washington. When talking to the Assistant Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, to representatives of the United States National Security Council, the NSC, and of the Pentagon, he tried to convince the US government that the situation required the leadership of the United States of America. The only solution for the current blockade that promised success would be the US shuttle diplomacy between Belgrade and Pristina. It was also necessary to include military actions when considering options, what the Germans said. Since the WEU would not have been a feasible option, according to the German Ministry of Defense, a solution within the framework of NATO would also require US leadership. The US Department of State, especially Talbot, was assumed that he would be given the task, was very interested in this proposal. He even asked Ischinger to present his statements on the necessity of military component to the Pentagon and to the NSC. The idea to build a credible military threat scenario against the FOI had fallen on sympathetic ears, especially in the US Department of State. But until the second half of May 1998, US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright failed to overcome the resistance of the White House. After European military measures had been deemed impossible, the French and Italian governments introduced the idea of military measures into NATO in early May. The German Foreign Office had been informed, however, it preferred that Germany did not initiate the examination of military options, but later supported the French-Italian proposal. At that time, the German Federal Ministry of Defense still tried to convince NATO to drop the development of a military threat scenario against Milosevic. It was not alone in this opinion. The US Pentagon was also skeptical about the idea. The analysis of the conduct of the German federal government in the search for international solutions of the Kosovo conflict revealed interesting details regarding the functioning of German foreign and security policy. There was a disagreement between the German Foreign Office of the German Federal Ministry and of Defense with regard to the question whether and how credible military pressure should be used as a political instrument. Interestingly, something similar was observed within the US administration. While the two ministries of defense were rather reluctant to use military means, the two foreign ministries were more inclined to favor them. But this can only surprise at first glance. This is based on a different strategic understanding. Both in the German Foreign Office and in the US Department of State, the threat of military activities of NATO against Milosevic was a political instrument, along with other political and economic sanctions, for instance, to enforce political interests. These different foreign policy instruments allowed for actions tailored to the specific situation. In the opinion of foreign policy experts, the threat of military means was leveraged to achieve political objectives. Insofar, it did not present a moral or ethical problem, since the foreign policy actors did not really intend to wage war. Rather, according to their understanding, they only threatened with war. This opinion, however, was diametrically opposed to the operational military understanding of the use of armed forces. In the latter event, the military, in this case NATO, and its member states, in certain scenarios needed to be capable of implementing the threatened use of force, not only theoretically, but also in specific situations and practice. This required credibility, which in turn implied the capability to implement an appropriate military structure, equipment, and training. In line with this logic, the relevant ministries of defense and military officials understood what a threat to use military force should only be made if those who made it were ready and able to employ it as an ultimate consequence. Otherwise, NATO and its national armed forces would forfeit their credibility according to military officials. This was to result in a loss of power and thus a limited protective function. The rationale behind this was the fear of getting sucked into military adventures with unpredictable consequences. In the present instance, this way of military thinking was shaped to a considerable degree by the US view, which obviously had been adopted or shared by German Federal Ministry of Defense officials, with Federal Minister Volker Rühr himself at the top, but also by the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, German General Klaus Naumann. Once made, the threat of military use had to be carried out in order to maintain credibility. This also explains the initial rejection and unease of the German Federal Ministry of Defense, of Federal Minister Rühr and General Naumann, but also of the US Ministry of Defense. Against this background, it becomes obvious why, after June 11, 1998, consensus was reached among NATO member states about the threat of military measures from the entire spectrum. That's what they decided at this meeting. It was the military officials in NATO and the relevant national ministries of defense who now pressed ahead, with the planning process on which the threats were based, and who urged to implement these plans if Milosevic did not cooperate. It was therefore German and US foreign policy officials who insisted on the threat of military force against the advice of their respective fellow ministers from the other national ministries of defense. When the threats had been made, or once the threats had been made, they started a military machinery which resulted in the outbreak of the air war of NATO against FRY due to the underlying understanding. This could easily have grown into a major European ground war. The fact that this was not a far-fetched idea becomes apparent when considering that the planning of a ground invasion had started as early as mid-April 1999, at the instance of NATO military officials after the air war did not have the desired success and Milosevic seemed to be far from relenting. This is also based on the idea of credible threats and of thinking military operational actions through to the end. By the way, they planned an attack with 175,000 NATO soldiers. In the case of Germany, after the military planning process of NATO had begun in the early summer of 1998, the advocates of this credible threat doctrine succeeded in convincing the politicians that it was absolutely necessary to implement the threat from the fall of 1998. The US government had already decided in favor of this in summer of 1998. Beginning with the so-called activation warning of NATO for the planned air operations on September 23, 1998, the logic of military action successively followed an increasingly military thinking. When NATO decided on the activation order finally on October 13, 1998, all NATO partners had followed the credible threat rationale, including France and Italy, who had hesitated until the end, and above all, the German Foreign Office. Until October 12, 1998, German Foreign Minister Kinkel had refused to adopt the participation of German armed forces in their air operations without a valid mandate of the United Nations. In the end, all NATO member states approved. After the political efforts of the international community to end violence in Kosovo had failed to yield results, violence had resurged at the beginning of 1999, as my example in the beginning showed. Serbian security forces responded to the violence of UČK with massive measures of repression while accepting civilian victims. In March 1999, hundreds of thousands of displaced persons were on the run both within Kosovo and seeking refuge abroad. After the failure of the political process, the NATO member states had no alternative than to carry out the airstrikes they had threatened Milosevic with in order to prevent a humanitarian disaster. In the evening of March 24, 1999, NATO launched an air war of the alliance against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia with an air force of 350 aircraft. In the evening, when the airstrikes began, US Secretary of State Albright expressed her opinion, which was quite representative, saying, quote, "I don't see this as a long-term operation. I think that this is something that is achievable within a relatively short period of time," unquote. Until the end of the airstrikes, 78 days later, on June 10, 1999, more than 900 aircraft from 14 member states of the alliance participated in more than 38,000 sorties, dropping more than 28,000 bombs and missiles over FOI territory. Finally, the responsible officials in NATO and Germany had agreed that a short engagement with manageable losses, as they believed, and costs was a smaller and thus more acceptable evil than an assumed loss of credibility and power following the non-implementation of a threat once made, which would in turn endanger international and national security. In view of this finding, recent military history faces a very interesting question of whether and to what degree such mindsets in foreign and security policy might have been a driving force contributing to the escalation dynamics and thus play a not insignificant role in the outbreak of conflicts, modern conflicts and wars. The question of how such conflict dynamics can be found in earlier wars as well would be of interest not only from a historian's perspective. Obviously, wars cannot be easily calculated. In 1999, the NATO member states officials could not imagine not to carry out the engagement once they had threatened Milosevic. Just like we today, they could not have known what would have happened otherwise. After a steady expansion of the air war, the beginning preparations for a ground invasion of NATO into Kosovo, and the increasing political pressure of the international community, Milosevic finally relented. The air war ended in the early morning hours of June 10, 1999. The invasion of the Kosovo force, KFOR, which began on June 12, 1999, ended also the civil war on the ground. As a result, the military intervention of NATO had not only considerably contributed to ending expulsion and massive flight of Kosovo Albanians and containing violence in general, the military intervention of NATO against FOI de facto also contributed to the independence of Kosovo. For the first time in their history, the United Nations assumed broad responsibility also with an executive mandate. With UN Security Council Resolution 1244 of June 10, 1999, they were tasked with the establishment of a civilian interim administration in Kosovo to ensure that inhabitants of Kosovo, which de facto still belonged to Serbia, it was a province of Serbia, could live autonomously from Belgrade until the clarification of status. The ethnic tensions between Kosovo Albanians and Kosovo Serbs resulting from this unsolved issue repeatedly led to unrest that escalated on the 16th and 17th of March 2004 into extensive riots which lasted for several days and were mainly directed against Kosovo Serbs but also against other minorities. Until then, the international community had made great efforts in various political talks within the contact group and later at the G8 level in order to exclude the sensitive issue of the status of Kosovo and instead had focused on the reconstruction of the province. It was only after the fierce riots of the spring of 2004 that UN mediation efforts began with the objective of obtaining a permanent solution of the status issue. After all efforts to obtain an amicable resolution of the conflict between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians had failed, Western states advocated a unilateral declaration of independence by Kosovo. As a prerequisite for their support, however, they conditioned the implementation of the plan for the solution of the Kosovo status issue with the help of an internationally supervised process which had been developed by Finnish United Nations Special Envoy Ahtisaari in 2007. On February 17, 2008, the day had finally come. The Parliament of Kosovo declared its independence. A new European state was born. The massacre of Ratchak? Question mark. After intensive investigations and forensic examinations, the following points had been proved as of year 2000. The death found above the village had been executed. There had been no fight, contrary to what the Serbs had repeatedly claimed. Among the 45 deaths, there were 2 women, 1 13-year-old boy, old and frail people. It could not be excluded, however, that the people, although not being UÇK fighters themselves, might have supported that organization. The mutilations of the bodies were probably the result of animal bites. This statement was of significance insofar as the condition of the bodies had largely contributed to the effect of the images of January 1999 in the media. One issue, however, could never be finally clarified. Had the killers of Ratchaks been Serbs, or had the UÇK staged a massacre in order to force NATO to intervene in the Kosovo conflict with military means? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter, very interesting. I would like to thank all the presenters for their interesting presentation. I also would like to spend one word to thank Pat, because he pleased all day in presenting, showing a picture that shows the warm and charming smile of the President Yanukovych. That is, I think, getting better for everybody. Now I leave the floor for the questions, if there are. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for the speaker. I would like to add 2 points to the last briefing. First of all, Kosovo has not been recognized worldwide, including in Europe. Spain has not recognized yet Kosovo, but this is not a worldwide recognized state in the United Nations. Second, correct me if I am wrong, NATO was involved in the Kosovo operation without a UN mandate. Is that correct or not?
In the airborne, yeah.
That's correct. The air war was conducted without the UN mandate. That was actually Germany's problem in the first place, and I tried to point out that even though there wasn't a mandate, in the end, although causing massive domestic problems in Germany, they still agreed. And this is how they were kind of drawn into this conflict. They had, the German government almost broke apart. This was the first red-green government, and they almost were split over that question. So it had massive problems. But after the end, they decided that the damage not to support NATO was the higher risk, and also joined the air war. But KFOR troops, they of course, they had a mandate, as I pointed out, but you're right, the air war, they didn't have a mandate. And it's also true, Kosovo is a sensitive issue, especially like Spain did not acknowledge Kosovo as a state. This is the central questions about whether it should be possible to intervene in the sovereignty of a state to support maybe more important issues like humanitarian rights or not. And this is basically a development which has started in the 1990s and led to the UN responsibility to protect which was embraced on 16th of September 2005. Although I admit the consequences of that resolution, they can be really discussed.
Mr. Van der Piet, please. Your extraordinary paper put my nostalgia in the top, because I was the commanding officer of Spanish frigate Catalonia, present in the scene of action the day of the Lido II. Your modesty impedes to you to say that the modus operandi of the Netherlands frigate was extraordinary. So extraordinary that all the navies of NATO could immediate the tactics used for the Netherlands in using our ships. Overall, the way to use the helicopter to put the men on board the other ship, and many other things. But in your conclusions, you made political statements about the not very good results of the shark war operation. But I think that from a military point of view, the shark war was an extraordinary result for the conclusion of the war. Because, for example, the oil of the Lido II was not for touristic affairs. I would like, if you can explain this, not the political point of view, the military point of view. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. What I said in my conclusion was that the maritime embargo only on a longer term had its influence on Belgrade. In fact, from the sea, nearly no oil or gas or other products were possible to come into Serbia-Montenegro. But there was another way to put the oil and gas and other stuff into Serbia-Montenegro, and it is by the river. It was a long, especially at night, they were very good in smuggling in these kind of goods, and it was also a land route by Albania, and at night there was a lot of smuggling going on. But indeed, Serbia suffered because of the embargo, but the Dutch government in itself wanted to have results very quickly. So to the frustration of the naval commanders, the Dutch naval commanders in this case, they did a good job. They were applauded within NATO naval circles, but it had no impression on the Dutch government in The Hague. So indeed, there was a naval result, but on the land and on the river there was still going on lots of smuggling, even especially in the first 1.5 years. But the Dutch government hadn't that patience to wait for that kind of result, and that's a pity, of course. But you're right, and the tactics that the Dutch used were indeed followed by many other navies. Thank you.
Ed Meralda, USA. Following on your comments, in fact, your paper as well. In fact, all three papers, I have to say, were excellent. Thoroughly enjoyed them. One thing, just an observation I'd like to make, and I'm sure you've had some of that in your talk, but the fact that these NATO countries had come together, NATO navies, and operated fairly well. Cooperation was very good at many operational levels, resulted from many years of these navies operating together. Standing Force Mediterranean, Standing Force Atlantic. They know each other, communications were compatible, there were many methods of operation that were known to all, so they fell into place pretty quickly. Positive development of NATO experience.
Knowledge of that, Wilbur. I don't have any personal knowledge.
No, in your opinion, not in your knowledge. I know you were not in the CIA. You don't have an alias.
That's not worse.
Russia's #1 objective at the end of the Cold War, when they became a new nation, was to be the only nuclear state in the region. Therefore, Ukraine had to give up. They had to get some arrangements to get Ukraine to give up its nuclear army and nuclear weapons. The United States' major nuclear security, national security policy was that there would be only non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. There would be no nuclear weapons, weapon states that would come out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there was, besides Russia, and there was no one. So both the United States and Russia. The second objective of the United States was to have an independent Ukraine, separate from Russia. So the CIA may have been involved, may have been. I don't know for sure. I have no real knowledge of this at all. Randy?
Sorry, Pat, my question is unfortunately not for you, although I think that's, I find the Ukraine endlessly fascinating, and I think we could probably have a whole session, not without any recorders in the room, about Ukraine, but that's another story. So my question is for Dr. Kleeman. You mentioned the impact of the Lewinsky scandal on the Clinton administration's decision-making processes, but to take a point from Dr. Van der Piet's comments just a moment ago, the pressure from Pentagon planners that would have demanded a military force, an intervention of 178,000 troops, is a direct variance with what most American politicians wanted in the Balkans. I think that we have to see, and I'm not trying to diminish the impact of the Lewinsky scandal, but there's a disjuncture in what military planners want and what State Department policymakers expect they can deliver with very small forces very quickly. And I think that disjuncture is something we should talk about afterwards, because it shows up in 1994 when the US is forced to pull out of the embargo operation in Sharpguard 5 years earlier. There's a real problem with the Pentagon trying to get what results the Clinton administration would have wanted with the resources it was willing to commit and on the time scale it was willing to match. So I think that we have to understand NATO's response, which was done at the 50th anniversary celebration of NATO. The air campaign starts within a day of it. Is really you have to really see it through that lens too. I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying I ask you to consider it.
Well, thank you very much for that comment, and you're absolutely right. There's a juncture and a difference in understanding how military works from the military personnel and foreign policy makers. But I think what I try to point out is Sandy Berger, the White House, not the State Department, not the Pentagon, the White House was very aware of that problem. And maybe Sandy Berger is not somebody who knows exactly the processes of military thinking, but he had a feeling, okay, we can't afford to be drawn into another scandal problem yet, because we don't know how this works. They just had witnessed Bosnia and was more than difficult. And the US public opinion, in the first place, well, they're like 35% pro sending troops to Kosovo, especially not ground troops. So, but what I was trying to argue, there's a certain decisive moment. And that moment is when military, when the credible threat is made. Once the credible threat is made, or the threat is made, it has to be in the view of the foreign policy establishment at Washington especially. It has to be credible. You can witness this in all other conflicts, because this is what the power of NATO, United States, depends on, which is absolutely plausible. And at that moment, the military thinking takes over. And then you have the delta you were talking about. And it is true, as I said, Madeleine Albright said, I think this is something achievable within a relatively short period of time. They're thinking just 350 planes, after 3 days it will be done. Well, obviously not.
I have a question for Pat Harrigan about Ukraine. At the time that some of these changes were happening, I don't know if it was 2014 or a little later, the newspaper seemed to think that all 5 Security Council members had guaranteed that they would protect Ukraine. You're saying that they said that they would recognize the sovereignty, but that there was no understanding that they would protect it, and therefore had no need to go in when Russia seized Crimea, for example.
The American head of the State Department, as well as the American Minister of Defense, testified to Congress that the agreement was just on paper. It was not a commitment of forces to protect Ukraine. I don't know about the other 4, but that's a good question. The question normally is, what do sanctions mean? What if you have an agreement, not sanction, if you have an agreement to guarantee sovereignty, if you have an agreement to guarantee borders without any backing to it, is it just a piece of paper or what? Normally, military forces have a border defense that protects the border from invasion. But this border was incredibly long and an incredibly powerful neighbor. So the question is, can small nations defend against larger nations who have great military forces? The answer is difficult to answer. You don't have a really good answer for it. Most times they cannot do it.
A follow-up then, what should Ukraine have requested or required as guarantees from these countries in order to persuade them to give up their nuclear force?
Ukraine got a good deal in everything, but should they have required Great Britain to come to their defense if Russia attacked? I don't think that would have happened. You know, the United States would not come to it. The United States was probably the most logical nation to do it, and it would not commit its forces to do that. It simply would not do that.
All right, thank you.
Please. This is the last one because we are really short.
Okay.
I just have a quick follow-up to Dr. Kreeman regarding the role of General Wes Clark in this power game between state and the White House. And where would you locate him?
Oh, that's a mean question, sir. it's difficult. I seriously cannot tell you where exactly to locate him. I can tell you he's on the thinking and understanding of also Klaus Naumann, that there has to be a credible threat. For sure, absolutely, because I can find that in the arguing of all these involved generals there. It's their identity, how they grew up in the military, how the thinking is graved in, basically. And his role is, well, it's a very interesting one, because there's of course also a national hat he's wearing. That's not precisely your question, but he's also acting during the Kosovo War as a national American, because there's quite a part of troops which are not under the command of NATO, and where he can, for example, order airstrikes where 20 civilians can be killed, collateral damage, which is unthinkable for the other NATO states. So that is something interesting I noticed there. And I also noticed arguments during the campaign between international officers and Wesley Clark, where they, in order, and that is something from the White House again, they try to stop the campaign by hitting Milosevic's ministry, basically, or the White Palace, and they tried to do it with like 22 missiles. And then there was a phalanx of international officers. That's at least what Klaus Naumann said, who said, okay, you can't do that, you can shoot with 22 tons of explosive. And then the understanding of the Americans, okay, this is the enemy, we're in war, okay, period. So that is some interesting side effect. And to end my argument, there's an interesting note I would like to share with you. There was a mutual fear of General Naumann and Wesley Clark they shared. It was a fear of getting handbagged by Madeleine Albright.
Thank you very much again to all the speakers and the audience for this very interesting session that brings us to the present time. And thank you very much again. See you. Bye.